Our first reading today offers a final exchange between Jesus and religious leaders in Jerusalem. Just prior to this conversation with a legal scholar representing other Pharisees, Jesus had silenced a group of Sadducees questioning him about his understanding of resurrection. This is a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 to 46. After the Sadducees came to speak with Jesus, but ended up speechless before him, the Pharisees met together. One of them, who was a legal expert, came to test Jesus. "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands." Then Jesus asked the Pharisees, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" "David's son," they replied. He said, "Then how is it that David, inspired by the Holy Spirit, called Christ Lord, when they said, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right side until I turn your enemies into your footstool'? If David calls him Lord, how can he be David's son?" Nobody was able to answer him, and from that day forward, nobody dared to ask him anything. Our next reading is an excerpt from a campaign speech given by Harvey Milk in 1973 when he was running for municipal office in San Francisco. When he was finally elected to the Board of Supervisors in 1977, he was the first openly gay official elected in California. Tragically, he was assassinated in 1978 by Dan White, a former San Francisco city supervisor. If we wish to rebuild our cities, we must first rebuild our neighborhoods. And to do that, we must understand that the quality of life is more important than the standard of living. To sit on the front steps, whether it's a veranda in a small town or a concrete stoop in a big city, and to talk to our neighbors is infinitely more important than to huddle on the living room lounger and watch a make-believe world and not quite live in color. And I hardly need to tell you that in the 19 or 24-inch view of the world, cleanliness has long since eclipsed godliness. Soon we'll all smell, look, and actually be laboratory clean, as sterile as the inside as on the out. The perfect consumer, surrounded by the latest appliances. The perfect audience, with a ringside seat to almost any event in the world, without smell, without taste, without feel, alone and unhappy in the vast wasteland of our living rooms. I think that what we actually need, of course, is a little more dirt on the seat of our pants, as we sit on the front stoop and talk to our neighbors once again, enjoying the type of summer day where the smell of garlic travels slightly faster than the speed of sound. I share these words now in a spirit of love and openness. On Friday, the temperature shot up above 20 degrees C, so I sat in my yard to enjoy what will likely be one of the last warm days of 2020. As I watched my neighbors, human and non-human alike, I felt like I was channeling Harvey Milk, preferring to sit on a concrete stoop to watching TV from a lounger. In our gospel, Jesus speaks about loving neighbor as a way to love God, and I got a sense of that as I sat there feeling a sense of loving connection. It was a nice feeling, especially since the connection felt reciprocal, God loving me through my neighbors as much as the other way around. That sense of connection feels in short supply right now, making Harvey's words seem pretty prescient. The extent of withdrawal into our homes is more pronounced than it was in the 70s, and though we are in a pandemic, we relied even more upon to be consumers, all possible through the click of a mouse. Devices are essential as we go back into family-only bubbles, yet they can be our downfall as many engage in social media, able to disconnect from diverse opinions, fellow citizens becoming enemies, let alone anyone else in other parts of the world. Given this, Jesus' teaching to love our neighbor is more important than ever. And it wasn't just his teaching. Christians often think Jesus broke with his Jewish heritage, but his answer reveals how much he was influenced by the teachings of Hillel, an influential rabbi who lived shortly before he was born. It's from Hillel we get the classic golden rule, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to others." That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. And like Hillel, Jesus accepted Gentiles, something early Christians expanded upon, seeing Jews and Gentiles as equal before God. I share this as a reminder of our inclusive roots. Before Christians began to see Jesus as the only way to God, and consequently started to treat Jews, then people with other beliefs, other groups of people, practically as enemies. Tragically, this is still our experience. In fact, even more so. Anti-black, anti-indigenous, anti-immigrant sentiment coming from those claiming to follow Jesus, even Canadians. Given this, let's see what insight the Bible can give us beyond our love our neighbor text. The first thing to note is that Jesus is quoting from Leviticus. This is critical because Leviticus doesn't just say that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, but we are to love the foreigner who lives amongst us as ourselves as well. So often we want to view neighbors only as those who are like us. But in the biblical ethic, neighbor is seen much more broadly. Further, in our individually focused culture, we miss that in Jesus' day, you saw yourself through the lens of others, especially family. Your family is an extension of yourself and vice versa. So loving neighbor and the foreigner as yourself is to love them as family. I find this so helpful in this divisive climate of ours. One of the gifts of family is you usually want the best for those who you love, for them to thrive, to use their full selves to become all that they can be. I bet that understanding is what helped shift Pope Francis in regard to same-gender relationships. You can't keep saying to LGBTQI+ people that they're part of the family and still deny us having our own. He came to see the pain that kind of denial causes. So let's apply that same image to quote-unquote foreigners. If we want people to thrive, then how can we encourage immigration and yet create barriers to employment when people get here? Similarly, how can we claim to be compassionate, but then narrow the ability for people to claim refugee status? Sadly, the rhetoric around immigrants and refugees is influenced by a narrative that sees them as burdens. We may be nicer and say we have a responsibility to welcome people, especially those seeking safety, but the quote-unquote love we are showing is only flowing in one direction, grounded in a desire to be good, to be dutiful. But I wonder, is that really treating others like their family? I recently listened to a lecture about immigration given by Dr. M. Daniel Carroll Rodas at Fuller Theological Seminary. He said that when we discuss the issue of immigrants, and in the U.S. this includes those who are undocumented, we often appeal to Genesis, focusing on how we are all created in God's image. But this is an important text because it reminds us how we're all worthy of respect and care. Yet if we stop there, the focus is on our duty to provide for immigrants and refugees. You can see how a burden narrative arises. Carol Rodas suggests instead that we also need to consider how the text tells us to subdue the earth. He isn't talking about our extractive economy and the impact that's had. At its writing, the passage was about the part we play in working the earth. He suggests that this part of Genesis is speaking about our potential as human beings. And that is how we need to frame our conversations about immigration. If as family we want one another to thrive, we need to think in terms of people's gifts, skills, abilities, to lift up whatever we all can contribute to the common good. Now this analysis applies to all neighbors. As I said, it applies to those of us who identify as LGBTQI+. But it also applies to those who are neurodiverse, those of us who are disabled, those of us who are vulnerably housed teens, those of us who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Important to consider as tensions simmer in Nova Scotia and flare up in Caledonia. Many Canadians see Indigenous people through the same burden, perhaps duty narrative. Even though the money for housing, education, healthcare, and the like don't come from taxes, but all come from a trust established when land was first purchased by settlers. But that burden narrative still is there, engendering resentment. So most people fail to see that the fastest growing demographic in the country is thousands of young people with much potential ready to contribute to the wider community. Similarly, commercial fishers are mainly thinking about what they might lose, but Mi'kmaq fishers earning a moderate living in the area will in turn contribute to it. That's how family works. Everyone giving what they can, looking after each other. Which of course brings me back to Harvey Milk, calling on us to get off our loungers and sit on our stoops. When we do, we will get to know each other beyond culture, beyond race, beyond any other category, and discover each other's gifts. Discover that we are all family, able and willing to help each other to thrive, and not just those who live beside us, but all around the world. Then we will realize that it is always less about us loving God by loving our neighbor, but it's been God loving us through our neighbors all along.